Her son-in-law made the joke. She's here for the free food. Kat Hollis, elegant host and grandmother-to-be, didn't flinch. Her daughter's silence cut deeper than the laughter that followed. By evening, the trays were cleared, the wine was gone, and every signature tied to the house had already been changed. She'd spent 4 years giving them shelter. By morning, they would learn what silence can cost. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun draped its golden light across the vineyard, casting long shadows over the gathering of guests seated on elegant white chairs. The air was rich with the scent of wildflowers and chilled wine, the sound of glasses clinking as people whispered and laughed amongst themselves. Kat's property, sprawling and verdant, was the perfect backdrop for the baby shower. A stunning space that should have felt festive, light, and relaxed. But as the guests mingled, there was something almost imperceptible in the air, a low hum of tension, an undertow just beneath the surface. Kat smiled softly as she stepped into the center of the gathering, carrying a silver tray filled with miniature tarts she had personally baked. Each delicate creation was topped with glistening fruit, their crisp edges catching the sunlight as she moved through the crowd. Her movements were graceful, purposeful. This was her moment, the culmination of her efforts to make today perfect. A small indulgence for her friends and family, a way to celebrate the upcoming arrival of her granddaughter. She set the tray down gently on the table, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. Ty, always a quick wit, was laughing with a group of friends at the far end of the yard. His voice cut through the noise, louder than the others. "She's just here for the free food, right?" Ty chuckled, nudging a friend as if the joke were harmless. The moment hung in the air for a beat, the laughter ringing in the background, but Marissa, standing beside him, froze. Her smile faltered, and her gaze darted to her mother, Kat, who stood motionless by the tray of tarts. Marissa didn't respond. She didn't defend her mother. Instead, she awkwardly shrugged, a gesture that said everything without speaking a word. She hadn't spoken up when it mattered, and now the silence between them was louder than anything Ty had said. Kat's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray, but she didn't let her lips tremble. Her face remained unreadable as she placed the platter down. Her eyes met Marissa's, but there was no emotion, no accusation, just a faint quietness that only Marissa seemed to notice. A few of the guests laughed, but the sound felt hollow, somehow forced, like a song that had been played too many times. Grace, ever the sharp one, caught the undercurrent. She lifted an eyebrow and glanced between Ty and Kat, trying to place what had shifted in the room. "Did I just hear that right?" Grace asked, her voice light, almost playful, but her eyes locked onto Kat. Kat, still composed, met her gaze without flinching. "You did," she said simply. There was no trace of anger in her tone, no sharp edge, but something colder hung in her voice now, something that spoke to years of untold stories, of small slights and quiet sacrifices that never made it into the light. Her response wasn't an accusation. It was a simple acknowledgement. She knew what had been said, but more than that, she knew exactly what was meant by it. Marissa's face turned slightly pink, and for a moment it looked like she might say something, maybe defend her mother, but the words died before they could form. She had spent so much of her life trying to make everyone happy, her friends, her family, her mother, but at that moment, there was no room for any of it, no way to fill the space between them. The laughter continued, but it was strained now, like a record skipping. People began shifting their weight, glancing uncomfortably at one another, unsure of how to move forward. The air had shifted, and the weight of the joke hung thick in the space between them all. Kat stepped back slightly, her eyes softening for just a fraction of a second before she turned toward the small group of women near the far end of the garden. A small but deliberate retreat, a silent decision to remove herself from the noise, to put some distance between herself and the moment that had just passed. Ty, sensing the unease that had spread like wildfire, offered a half-hearted apology, trying to backpedal, but it was too late. The damage was done. The words couldn't be taken back. The humor had soured into something more cutting, more real than anyone had intended. Marissa stayed where she was, her eyes lowered, her mind racing to figure out where she had gone wrong. Should she have said something sooner? Should she have stopped Ty before it had gone this far? But the silence stretched out, and the moment passed, leaving behind only the echo of words that weren't quite funny anymore. Kat stood apart, a solitary figure now among the guests, her smile gone, the joy of the day slipping through her fingers like the last rays of the sun sinking beneath the horizon. And then, as if nothing had changed, the group shifted. New conversations blossomed. The chatter picked up again, but there was an unmistakable tension, an absence of something that hadn't been there before. For 4 years, the house had been a safe harbor, or so they'd convinced themselves. At first, it had all seemed so easy, so temporary. Kat had offered them the guest cottage, her daughter, Marissa, and her family, when things had gone awry. The property, tucked behind rows of old gnarled oaks and sprawling vineyards, had felt like a sanctuary in a storm. But like any sanctuary, it had its own set of rules, its own quiet weight. And as time wore on, those rules, unspoken but understood, had become less of a bridge and more of a barrier. Kat had always been clear on one thing: they'd be living there temporarily. A transition, she'd said, the words soft but firm, almost like a promise wrapped in a veil. There was never any doubt that she would want the place back, but now it was a different kind of transition, one that left more scars than sweet memories. The title of the house, the deed, was still in Kat's name, untouched by anyone else. It always had been, and Kat made sure it stayed that way. She didn't need to remind them. It was a quiet, unspoken contract that had existed long before any of them moved in. Emma, however, had been the one to approach the issue directly. She had always been the practical one, the one who measured everything in cold logic. "You can do this clean," she'd told Kat just days before. "No drama, no warning, just do it." Kat hadn't hesitated. She'd agreed. Grace, however, had a different view. She laughed, low and almost mockingly. "Don't even warn her," she'd said, her words dripping with an edge of something darker, something more cynical. "Let it hit like a breeze-turned storm." Kat hadn't agreed, but she hadn't disagreed either. Grace's words had lingered in her mind, swirling like dust, forming shapes in the air she couldn't shake. She wasn't one for storms. Her nature was more like the steady hand, the calm before the chaos. She wouldn't do it the way Grace had suggested. No, she'd do it her way. "I'll tell her," Kat had replied, voice steady. But after the key clicks, Kat hadn't spoken much more about it, but the weight of the decision was heavy. She wasn't sure how Marissa would react, or how any of them would. They'd all been so sure that this arrangement would last forever. But it had always been temporary, hadn't it? The decision to file for immediate title reassignment came swiftly. Emma wasted no time. She took the reins, a clear, concise request to the courts. The paperwork had been filed, all the I's dotted, all the T's crossed. The deed was about to change hands. No one would be able to argue. There would be no last-minute pleas or excuses. The morning it was all set in motion, Kat found herself driving past the guest cottage. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel with a kind of tension that was almost painful. She glanced over at the weathered stone structure as she passed. It was a simple thing, unassuming, tucked away behind a wall of ivy, but now it felt like a different kind of reminder. Mia, her granddaughter, was working there on weekends, helping out with chores and doing odd jobs. Kat could see her through the small window, bent over a ledger or pulling weeds from the garden beds, looking every bit the young woman she was becoming. It was a sight that made Kat's chest tighten, a pang of something unfamiliar. Her granddaughter was growing up fast, too fast. And the fact that Mia worked there, in a place that had once been home to all of them, was a stark reminder of what was changing. The car slowed as Kat's eyes locked on the cottage one last time. She could see Mia's face, framed by the window. The image caught her off guard, like a flash of something fleeting, something she'd never quite grasped before. A shadow passed over Mia's face as she turned to something inside, disappearing from view. Kat didn't stop. She couldn't. Her grip on the wheel tightened, and she accelerated, forcing herself to look ahead instead of the quiet building she'd once shared with her family. It was easier to focus on the road, easier to avoid what lay behind her. But in the pit of her stomach, the knot remained. She had given them everything, and now, as the deed was about to change hands, she wondered whether any of them had ever understood the gravity of her gesture, whether anyone had ever read the fine print of what they had agreed to when they moved in. The key was turning. The transition was in motion, and the storm that Grace had hinted at, it was already on the horizon. The front door slammed open with a force that rattled the old wooden frame, the sound reverberating through the house like a clap of thunder. Ty stormed into the kitchen, his face contorted in a mix of disbelief and frustration. His eyes were wild, darting from the countertops to the open window, as if searching for some sign of reason, something that would make sense of what he'd just seen. Did something change with the Gardner account? Ty's voice was sharp, clipped. His hands were fisted at his sides, as if holding back from throwing something, anything, to match the growing tension in his chest. Kat, who had been calmly sipping her coffee, didn't flinch. She set the mug down on the table with a deliberate slowness, as though her own emotions were carefully measured, contained. She didn't let the urgency of his outburst disturb her. "It's all changing, Ty," she said, her voice even, but there was a quiet steel behind it. The words landed between them with an unsettling finality. She didn't need to say more. He could hear it. He could feel it, the shift. Ty's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he was going to explode, to demand more. More answers, more explanations. But then, just as quickly, the weight of it all seemed to settle in. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to understand. Marissa, who had been seated at the kitchen island playing absent-mindedly with a coffee cup, glanced up. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an unmistakable edge to her gaze. She sensed the tension, knew it had been building for days, but she didn't say anything. The words were there, hanging on the tip of her tongue, but she let them stay buried. It wasn't her place to intervene, not anymore. She shifted in her seat, her fingers pressing into the ceramic, trying to anchor herself in the moment. Grace, sitting across the room, smiled into her own cup of coffee, the corners of her mouth pulling up in something between a smirk and a knowing look. Her eyes twinkled, but there was something far darker beneath her playful exterior. "Hope he likes yard work," Grace said lightly, as if she were commenting on the weather rather than the storm brewing in the room. Her words floated in the air, light but sharp, a reminder of the new reality they were all facing. She had no illusions about the cost of what was happening. She was already thinking ahead, savoring the unfolding drama. Emma, who had been quietly observing, looked up from her phone, the corners of her lips tightening in an almost imperceptible smile. The paperwork had been filed. The asset transfer was confirmed. The deed was done. She could almost hear the weight of the changes settling into the air around them. "It's recorded," Emma said, her tone businesslike, but there was an underlying satisfaction in her voice, effective immediately. The words hung there for a moment, sinking into the space between them like stones dropped into water. Ty's face twisted in shock, and for the first time since his entrance, he took a step back, his gaze flicking from Emma to Kat, the implications of her statement starting to land. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The magnitude of the situation was finally becoming clear, and it was as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Everything he thought he knew had just slipped out of his grasp. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, the first signs of a storm rolling in on the horizon. The quiet before it, the oppressive heaviness, settled into the room. Mia walked through the back door, just as the air seemed to thicken with unspoken words. She had a basket of groceries in her hands, the simple act of dropping them off feeling oddly ceremonial in the moment. She was still smiling, unaware of the undercurrent of tension that had taken over the house, the quiet battle that had already begun. "Hey, Grandma," Mia said, her voice light as she walked into the kitchen. She set the basket down, and as she turned back toward Kat, she noticed the plain envelope in her hands. Kat didn't say a word. She handed it over wordlessly, the envelope plain and unmarked, its contents an unspoken finality. Mia looked at it curiously, then back at Kat, sensing something in the air. "What's this?" Mia asked, a slight furrow in her brow. But Kat didn't answer. She just nodded, a silent acknowledgement that everything had shifted. The house was no longer the sanctuary it once was. The winds had changed, and Mia was now standing at the epicenter of it all, holding the letter that symbolized the final step of a transition no one had seen coming. As Mia's fingers brushed over the envelope, something cold crept over her. It was more than just a letter. It was a key to something much larger, something she wasn't yet ready to face. And as she took it from Kat's hand, the storm outside broke, its first gust of wind rattling the windows. The phone's sudden ring broke the silence, its shrill tone slicing through the kitchen. Marissa glanced at the unfamiliar number on the screen, a sudden sense of unease bubbling in her chest. She hesitated, but then answered, trying to sound casual. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was smooth and professional. "Ms. Jacobs, this is Trina from Riverstone Insurance. We're following up on the policy for the cottage. Can you confirm some details?" Marissa frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm not sure why you're calling me. The account's always been in Kat's name. Shouldn't she be the one you're speaking to?" There was a slight pause, then Trina's voice returned, firm. "Actually, ma'am, Kat Jacobs is no longer listed on the account. It's in your name now." The words hit Marissa like a jolt. She blinked, trying to grasp the reality of what she'd just heard. "Wait, what?" The voice on the other end was unwavering. "Your name's the primary on the policy now. Please check your email for the full confirmation." Marissa's hand shook as she ended the call, her mind racing. She turned slowly toward Kat, who sat at the kitchen table, unmoved, sipping her coffee as if nothing had changed. "Why did the insurance company call me directly?" Marissa demanded, her voice sharp now, the confusion turning to something darker. Kat set her mug down with measured calm, her gaze never leaving Marissa. "Because I'm not on the account anymore," she said, her tone cool, almost indifferent. Ty, who had been leaning against the counter, watching the exchange, couldn't help but scoff. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "This is just another one of your tricks." Kat didn't react, her eyes still fixed on Marissa, unwavering. She'd never needed to explain herself to Ty before, and today wasn't going to be any different. Emma, who had been quietly observing, pulled out her phone with a knowing look. "She's not bluffing, Ty," Emma said, her voice even as she handed her phone to him. "The asset transfer's done. The deed is official." Ty looked at the phone, his face draining of color as the weight of Emma's words sank in. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His chest tightened, a mix of anger and disbelief flooding him. But there was nothing left to argue. Outside, the sky had darkened, the first signs of a storm rolling in, as if the world outside mirrored the shifting tension within the house. It was an oppressive quiet, the calm before the chaos. Mia, unaware of the tension in the room, walked in with a basket of groceries, the everyday act of delivering them feeling suddenly ceremonial. She set the basket down, and as she turned to face Kat, she noticed the plain envelope in her hands. "What's this?" Mia asked. Curiosity piqued as she took the envelope from Kat. Kat didn't speak. She simply handed it over, her eyes soft yet distant. Mia tore open the envelope, the contents inside immediately catching her eye. It was a pre-approval letter for a cottage property, a full down payment, funded entirely by Kat. Grace, who had been watching from the corner of the room, let out a quiet chuckle. "She's giving a home to the one who never made her feel homeless," she remarked, her voice light, but tinged with something far darker. Marissa's eyes flicked between Kat and the letter in Mia's hands, her confusion giving way to frustration. "What's going on, Mom?" she asked, her voice thick with hurt. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Kat's gaze was unwavering as she looked at her daughter, her words quiet but firm. "Watch and learn, honey." Mia stood there, frozen for a moment, the weight of the letter in her hands sinking in. It wasn't just a house, it was more than that. It was a gesture that spoke of everything they had taken for granted. The roof they once believed would always shelter them had shifted, its foundation cracked and rearranged. What they thought was stable was no longer theirs to hold. And as the storm outside finally broke, the first gust of wind rattling the windows, Mia understood nothing would ever be the same. Marissa's hands shook as she ended the call with Ty, her thoughts racing. His words echoed in her mind, dismissing her panic with an ease that made her feel even more unmoored. "It's probably just a glitch," he had said, as if the world she'd known hadn't just crumbled, as if Kat's silent withdrawal from their lives was nothing more than a technical error. Marissa stood there for a moment, staring at the blank screen of her phone, trying to calm her racing heart. But nothing about this felt like a glitch. The house, the insurance, the coldness in the air, everything was shifting, and she was helpless to stop it. Before she could gather herself, Grace's voice cut through the heavy silence. "You built your comfort on her spine." She finally stood up. The words landed hard, each syllable like a slap. Marissa turned slowly to face her, her chest tightening with the sting of truth. It was clear now, Kat had been the one holding them all together, quietly, unwaveringly. And now, without warning, she was letting go. Marissa opened her mouth to defend herself, but Grace didn't give her the chance. "She's done, Marissa. And you're just now realizing it." The words dug deep, sharper than anything Grace had ever said. And they were true. They had all taken so much from Kat over the years, relying on her stability without ever thinking about what would happen if she decided to stop giving. Before Marissa could respond, the doorbell rang, snapping her from her thoughts. She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to pull herself together. When she opened the door, Mia stood there with a basket of groceries in her arms, her smile faltering as she stepped inside. Behind her, Kat followed, her presence commanding yet silent. Kat held a small boutique bag in her hand. She walked straight into the kitchen and handed it to Mia without a word. The weight of the gesture felt heavier than the storm that was beginning to rage outside. Mia looked inside the bag, her face confused. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as she saw what Mia had pulled out. A baby blanket. It was the same blanket Marissa had wanted years ago. The one she had stared at in the boutique, wishing she could afford it but always falling short. The one she'd wanted but never gotten. Mia glanced up at Kat, her brow furrowing as if searching for an explanation. "For when your time comes," Kat said, her voice soft but firm. There was no warmth in it, no hidden message, just the cold finality of a decision made. Mia didn't say anything. She simply held the blanket, her fingers tracing the fabric, trying to understand what it all meant. But she didn't need to ask. The weight of the moment, the passing of something once held so tightly, hung in the air. Marissa stood motionless, her thoughts swirling as she tried to process it all. She wanted to say something, to demand answers. But before she could speak, Emma stepped into the room, her face grim. "It's done," Emma said. Her tone clipped. "All the accounts Kat used to fund, locked. Everything's frozen." The words hit Marissa like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, locked?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Exactly what I said," Emma replied, her gaze unwavering. "It's over. She's cut you off. No more transfers, no more access. Everything she had done for you, gone." The room felt colder, darker, as the reality of Emma's words settled in. Their safety net, their cushion, had been ripped away in an instant. The sense of security they had all taken for granted was now nothing more than a distant memory. Outside, the storm raged on, winds howling as the first gusts of rain beat against the windows. Marissa could feel the weight of it, the tension thick in the air. It was as if the storm outside mirrored the chaos inside, the world shifting in ways they couldn't control. Marissa's chest tightened, and she struggled to breathe. There was no going back now. The foundation they had built their lives on had been shattered, and what was left felt like a fragile illusion. And as the storm continued to roar, Marissa realized with a sickening clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. Marissa stood still, her phone still pressed to her ear as Ty's frantic voice echoed in her mind. His attempt to argue had been futile. Emma's response as cold and final as the silence that now lingered in the room. "You can't just do this," Ty had shouted, the tension in his voice rising. "This isn't how things are supposed to go. She can't just cut us off like this." Emma had remained unmoved, her words clipped but firm. "She made her decision, Ty. This is what it is. There's no more to discuss." Marissa's fingers trembled around the phone, the distance between her and Ty's frustration widening with each passing second. He didn't understand. He couldn't. The weight of what Kat had done, the sharp, calculated finality of it, was beyond his comprehension. When the call finally ended, Marissa felt the heaviness in the room settle over her like a thick fog. She needed to breathe, to escape the suffocating pressure that had taken over the house, but there was no escaping it. Not now. She heard Grace's voice cut through the stillness. "Come on, Becca. Let's get out of here for a while. The air is too thick around here." Becca hesitated, looking between Marissa and her mother. "But I don't want to go." Grace smiled gently, but there was an edge of resolve in her expression. "We'll be back soon. Just need to clear our heads. It's been too tense around here." With a soft pull, Grace guided Becca toward the door, their footsteps fading as they left. Marissa felt a fleeting sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The house seemed even quieter without them. The stillness rang in her ears. The doorbell rang moments later, and Marissa found Mia standing in the doorway, holding a bag of groceries. She stepped inside, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, I just wanted to ask a couple of things about the new place," Mia said, her eyes darting around the room as if she, too, could feel the tension in the air. Kat, who had been silently watching from the kitchen, moved with purpose. She crossed the room to Mia, handing her the garage code without a word. Mia blinked at the piece of paper in her hand, a frown furrowing her brow. "Are you sure about this?" Kat simply nodded, her expression unreadable. There was no warmth in her tone, no kindness, only the cold precision of someone who had made a decision and was now moving on. Mia lingered for a moment, looking at Marissa with uncertainty, but then turned to leave, the door closing softly behind her. Marissa's eyes wandered back to the kitchen, to the pantry, and her breath caught in her throat. It was nearly empty, pristine, clean, but devoid of everything that had once filled it. There were no half-empty boxes of cereal, no jars of peanut butter, no snacks stashed away for late-night cravings. The shelves were bare, save for a few cans and some canned goods. It wasn't that Kat couldn't afford to stock up. No, this was something else. This was a deliberate cleansing. Every item that could remind her of the past, of the weight she had carried for so long, was gone. Marissa walked toward the pantry, running her fingers across the bare shelves, as if touching the emptiness might explain it all, but there was no explanation. She closed the door with a heavy sigh, but just as she did, her phone buzzed in her hand. Ty's name flashed on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ty?" she said, her voice cautious, not sure what to expect. "Marissa." Ty's voice cracked through the line, thick with frustration. "I tried calling her. I called Mom. She hung up on me, Marissa. She just hung up." Marissa's heart sank. She could hear the panic in his voice, the disbelief. But as her own heart hammered in her chest, she realized what it meant. Kat was done. She wasn't playing games anymore. Marissa didn't know what to say. She could feel the weight of Ty's words in her bones. The finality of it all pressed in on her like the storm outside. This wasn't just a warning. It was the beginning of something much worse, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the fallout. The house had never felt as quiet as it did that morning. Mia's footsteps echoed against the bare floors as she moved through the empty rooms. It felt like a hollow victory. This wasn't her dream. She had never wanted it to happen like this. But it had. Her eyes lingered on the spaces that had once been so familiar. Rooms filled with memories that were no longer hers to claim. The walls seemed to close in on her, the weight of the change sinking in. But there was no time to dwell on it. Mia was here to stay. Outside, Kat was already packing up her car. A small smile on her face. She wasn't moving to a new house. She was retreating, pulling back into something smaller, something that was just hers. The cottage. Grace stood beside her, a glass of wine in hand, watching her with quiet approval. "You never needed more room," Grace said, her voice soft but firm. "Just less noise." Kat smiled, nodding in agreement. The house had been too much, too loud, too filled with everyone's expectations and desires. The cottage, small and quiet, was where she would finally breathe again. Grace raised her glass. "To finding your peace." Kat took the glass from her, and for a moment, there was a calmness in her that hadn't been there before. It was as if the shift had somehow freed her. Meanwhile, Marissa stood in the driveway, her hands clutched tightly at her sides. She watched as Ty paced in front of his truck, his voice raised in anger. "This is insane," he yelled, his voice cracking with frustration. "She's just walking away from everything we've built. This can't be happening." Marissa didn't respond. She didn't feel like defending the decisions that had been made. There was nothing left to argue. Ty could shout all he wanted, but it wouldn't change anything. The house was no longer their house, and Kat was no longer their anchor. As Ty ranted, Marissa turned toward the front door of the house, her eyes falling on the lock. She stared at it, her heart heavy, as she heard the sharp click when it turned. It wasn't just a door closing, it was everything they had taken for granted, everything that had held them together, suddenly locking them out. She didn't cry. She couldn't. She was numb. Behind her, Becca, looking small in the shadow of the house, suddenly ran past her and toward the cottage. Kat was already pulling the door shut behind her, but Becca reached her just in time, throwing her arms around her. "Can I still visit here?" Becca asked, her voice soft, the vulnerability in her words cutting through the tension. Kat knelt down, her hand resting on Becca's back. She didn't need to say anything, didn't need to promise anything. She simply nodded, her eyes softening for a brief moment. Becca's hug lingered for a few seconds longer before she pulled away, her face clouded with a mixture of hope and confusion. The moment passed, and Kat stood, turning toward the small house she'd claimed for herself. Marissa remained on the driveway, Ty's voice still echoing in the background, but it felt distant now. Like a scene playing out too far away to matter. Kat's key turned in the lock once more, and this time it was the sound of an ending. The door clicked shut behind her, and the house, their house, was locked out for good. Outside, the world had never seemed quieter. The neighborhood was talking, the way it always did when something shifted too suddenly. They'd seen it, the turnover. People had noticed Kat moving out, Mia moving in, the subtle but undeniable ripple of change sweeping through the block. Neighbors gossiped across fences, friends shared the details over dinner, all of them with their own spin on things. To them, it was a story of Kat's retreat and Mia's quiet victory, but they didn't know everything. They didn't know the pain hidden behind the shift. They didn't understand what had really been lost. Mia, however, didn't feel victorious. She felt like an intruder in a place that wasn't hers, not fully. She had always known the house, but now it seemed like it was wrapped in a layer of someone else's history, someone else's dreams. "She gave me roots, not alone," Mia had said once, her voice quiet but strong, as she stood in the doorway of the house she now called home. She wasn't sure she could explain it to anyone who didn't know the truth, to anyone who hadn't seen the way Kat had woven herself into their lives, holding everything together, offering what wasn't asked for, giving without a thought to receiving. But for everyone else, it was just a story of inheritance. A house passed along, a place now occupied by someone else. Ty and Marissa stayed quiet. Marissa didn't have the energy for the world's judgment, and Ty was busy with something else, something that didn't seem to make a difference. He applied for rentals, but the places he found were too far away, too expensive. Nothing was close enough. Nothing felt right. Marissa had tried to reach out to Kat. She sent a message, suggested lunch at the little cafe they used to visit. She thought maybe that if they could just talk, really talk, things might go back to the way they were, but Kat declined. The message had been short, final, with no room for interpretation. "I'm good, thanks." It stung, but it was what Marissa expected, what she had been bracing for. Later, Grace caught her in the kitchen, her gaze steady. "You don't need to sit with people who stood against you," she said, her voice low, but filled with a knowing. "Let them be." Marissa didn't reply. Grace didn't need her to. Instead, Kat had found her own quiet peace. She joined Mia for dinner in the big house that evening. Something simple, a bowl of soup, a glass of wine, the clinking of cutlery as they sat together, finally in their own space. For the first time in weeks, Kat looked like herself again. The weight was off her shoulders, her eyes softer, not weighed down by expectations, by the endless noise. For the first time, Kat was herself. Meanwhile, Ty paced the floor, running his hand through his hair, frustration mounting with each rejection. He couldn't afford to rent a place nearby. The prices had skyrocketed. The city was changing, and the life he'd relied on, his comfortable, predictable world, was slipping through his fingers. He stood at the counter, staring at the list of properties he'd researched, none of them viable. His phone buzzed, but when he checked it, he saw the same message he'd gotten before, another rejection. He slammed the phone down with a frustrated curse. The thing he hadn't fully grasped yet was how much had really changed. This wasn't just about a house. It was about a life that had been carved out and then abandoned. And as much as Ty fought against it, the truth was there. Things were never going back. Kat was gone. The house was gone. And whatever he thought he'd had was slipping. Just like the storm clouds on the horizon, thick and impenetrable. The lock clicked shut, the doors swung closed, and the world outside remained silent. The phone rang in the quiet of the cottage, slicing through the calm that had settled over Kat. She didn't move at first, letting it ring a few times. The sound felt almost intrusive, disturbing the fragile peace she had finally built here. She had found herself in the stillness, a place where she wasn't constantly called upon, where the noise of everyone else's needs didn't drown out her own. Grace, always quick to respond, picked up the phone. She listened for a moment, then nodded quietly before she spoke. "It's time," Grace said, her voice low but filled with an undeniable certainty. Kat didn't look up. She remained seated by the window, watching the way the sun shifted in the sky. It was another slow, patient day, the world outside moving without rushing. Her fingers lightly traced the rim of the coffee cup on the table, but she stayed still, waiting. The phone call ended, and Grace's gaze found Kat. There was no need for words between them. Grace knew that Kat wasn't going to rush. Kat had already made her decision long ago, in the silence of her own heart. Marissa had texted her earlier, "Please." It was a simple message, but it carried the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Kat stared at it for a long time before responding. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then, with a deep breath, she typed, "I hope it's safe and smooth." There were no words of comfort, no promises of return, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been asked, and a simple wish for peace. The baby was born that afternoon. The delivery, as Marissa had feared, was painful and long. She needed someone, anyone, to tell her everything would be okay. But as the contractions came and went, there was only the sterile silence of the hospital room, and no reply from Kat. No words of encouragement, no comforting presence. Ty didn't text her either. He had been distant, his anger buried under layers of disappointment. His failure to reach out was almost worse than the silence from Kat. But life kept moving, the rhythm of it unaffected by the fractures that had formed between them. The next day, Mia showed up at the cottage, a warm pastry in hand. She smiled as she stepped through the door, her gaze searching for Kat. It was the kind of gesture Kat hadn't expected, but it felt right. It felt like a small offering in the quiet of this new world they were navigating together. "I thought you might like this," Mia said, setting the pastry on the table. Kat's eyes met hers, a soft smile curving her lips, but it was the words that followed that cut through the silence. "I used to be what they needed," Kat said, her voice steady but distant. "Now, I'm just who I am." Mia nodded, understanding more than words could convey. She didn't say anything else. Instead, she sat with Kat, sharing the quiet of the room, the pastry between them serving as a small bridge in the gap of all the things they had yet to say. Later, a small envelope arrived, addressed in Becca's handwriting. It was a drawing, simple and colorful, filled with the innocence of a child's love. The image of a house, with the sun shining brightly above it. Kat stared at the drawing for a long time. It was a simple thing, but to her, it was everything. Becca's way of saying she still cared, of asking if she could still be a part of the story. Kat reached for a frame, the glass catching the light as she carefully placed the drawing inside. It would sit on the mantel, a reminder of something that had once been. But this time, it was hers. Not for anyone else, not for anyone who expected anything from her, just for her, just for who she had become. And as the evening sun dipped lower, the world outside grew quiet again, leaving Kat alone with the fragile beauty of the life she had started to rebuild. The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, cutting through the calm of the cottage. Kat hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers lingering just above the screen. She already knew who it was. Ty. He'd been distant for weeks, but the timing of his call now, after everything, felt like another test, another attempt to tug her back into the past. She took a breath and answered. Kat, Ty's voice came through, thick with the weight of unresolved emotions. I think we should talk. I want to start over. A new chapter. With the baby and everything, maybe we can start over where? Kat's voice was steady, but cold, cutting through his words like a knife. I don't recall inviting you back. There was a long silence on the other end. Ty didn't say anything for a moment, his hesitation palpable. Kat could practically hear the anger simmering beneath his words. But she wasn't interested in his excuses anymore. The world had moved on, and she had moved with it. I'm serious, Kat. It doesn't have to be like this. Kat scoffed, but it was a hollow sound. She set the phone down and let it continue ringing, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest. There was nothing left to say. He couldn't start over, not with her. Not after all the broken promises. Her phone pinged again, but this time, it wasn't Ty. It was a voice message from Jordan. She clicked it, leaning back in her chair as she listened. The message was short, but the silence that followed felt heavy, stretching on for almost 2 minutes. She could hear Jordan's hesitation, his words left unsaid. I don't know what to say, Kat, he finally murmured, his voice uncertain. I just wanted you to know I'm here, if you need anything at all. The message ended, and Kat stared at the screen. There was no real offer, no real apology, just an empty gesture. She couldn't even bring herself to reply. She wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of waiting for people to step up. Tired of their half-hearted attempts to fix things. The silence between them felt more honest than any of the words ever had. Grace, who had been silently observing from the doorway, crossed the room and placed a hand on Kat's shoulder. Her touch was firm, reassuring, as always. You don't owe them a seat at a table they broke, Grace said softly, her voice steady, unwavering. Not anymore. Kat nodded slowly, the weight of Grace's words sinking in. It wasn't just Ty or Jordan, it was all of them. They had asked too much, given too little, and now they were out of her life for good. She was done. Later that day, Kat found herself sitting in the back of Mia's car, the quiet hum of the road underneath them. They were headed to a vineyard for wine tasting, something simple, something for themselves. Kat hadn't thought about the world beyond the cottage for days, and now, in the stillness of the ride, she found herself easing into it. The winery was serene, a place where time seemed to slow down. Mia handed her a glass of red, her eyes bright with excitement. We deserve this, she said with a grin, clinking her glass against Kat's. As they walked through the rows of vines, laughing quietly, a server approached them. He glanced at Kat for a moment before smiling politely. You're the one from the article, right? He asked, his voice light but curious. Kat froze, the words hitting her harder than expected. The article, the one that had appeared in the local paper, painting her as the woman who had stepped away from everything. She hadn't been ready for it, hadn't expected the world to look at her like this, but here it was, the reminder of everything she had shed. She forced a smile, nodding in acknowledgement. That's me, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The reality of her own story, laid out for everyone to see, was harder to shake than she'd thought. Mia caught her eye, understanding in her gaze. She didn't press, just wrapped her arm around Kat's shoulders and led her toward the next wine flight. The world could stare, could judge, could ask questions, but Kat knew she was finally living for herself. And as they walked away, the weight of the article, of the past, felt a little lighter. But somewhere, in the back of her mind, she could hear Ty's voice, still lingering like an echo. Kat's fingers lingered on the card attached to the bouquet, her eyes scanning the words in a detached kind of disbelief. I'm sorry for how things ended. I hope we can find a way back to what we were. The flowers, expensive lilies, perfect in their untouched beauty, sat on the kitchen counter, a bright, pristine apology in bloom. She picked them up, the weight of the delicate petals cold in her hands. They were beautiful, but they meant nothing. Not anymore. Grace watched her from the doorway, a knowing expression crossing her face as Kat walked toward the compost bin. Without a word, she dropped the flowers in. The soft crunch of the stems, a quiet confirmation of her decision. "You sure about that?" Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. "Those flowers cost more than your car." Kat's lips twisted into a wry smile, but there was no humor in it. "I don't do symbolic crumbs anymore," she said, her voice firm, unyielding. "They didn't mean enough when I needed them, and they sure don't now." Grace nodded, her expression softening with understanding. She knew this wasn't just about the flowers. It was about everything, about the way they had all taken without giving, about the endless cycle of waiting for apologies that never came. Kat turned, pushing the compost lid shut, and moved to the kitchen counter. She had already decided to do something that felt right, something more than words could offer. She grabbed her checkbook and began to write. She didn't hesitate. The check was written to a women's shelter under Mia's name, the numbers flowing easily as she signed it. It wasn't the first time she had donated. This was something deeper, something more meaningful. She wanted to ensure that Mia, someone who had always quietly supported her, would have the resources she needed to continue her work, to help those who truly needed it. Mia deserved this, far more than the people who'd tried to crawl back into her life with half-hearted apologies and empty gestures. This was Kat's way of drawing a line in the sand, of making sure that her support went where it would be appreciated, not squandered. Just as she finished signing, her phone buzzed with a message from Marissa. "Can we talk?" Kat stared at the screen for a long moment, the words seemingly hanging in the air. The temptation to reply was there, but she knew better. The past had already been written, and there was nothing left to say. She typed a simple response. No. Her finger hovered over the screen for a beat longer, but there was no point in adding anything more. The message was final, a conclusion drawn in a sentence. She set the phone down, her mind racing but at peace. The choice was made. Later, she sat at the dining room table with Emma, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. The papers in front of her were simple enough, an update to her will. She knew what had to be done. The world could judge her all it wanted, but her decisions were her own. Becca was in. She was the only one who truly saw Kat, understood her, and needed her. That was clear. Marissa and Ty, however, had never truly respected Kat, not in the way they should have. When Emma stood to notarize everything, her gaze met Kat's, steady and unwavering. There was no judgment there, only quiet understanding. Emma knew Kat wasn't making this decision lightly. The stamp echoed through the quiet room. Kat took a long, steady breath, feeling the finality of it all settle in. The lock had clicked shut on the past, and now she was free to walk forward, without the weight of old expectations holding her back. And as she watched Emma leave, she felt an odd sense of peace, a peace that only came when you stopped waiting for other people to make things right. The door clicked shut behind Emma, leaving Kat alone in the room, with nothing but her choices and the life she was finally beginning to live on her own terms. The envelope sat on the dining table, its edges worn with the passage of time. Kat had placed it there earlier in the day, and now, as the light dimmed, she found herself staring at it, feeling a quiet weight in her chest. She had known this moment would come, had known she couldn't leave things unsaid, unanswered, not when there was still so much she wished she could pass on, still so much she wanted to say. She opened the envelope slowly, almost reverently, and pulled out the letter she had written. Her handwriting was neat but quick, each sentence deliberate. It wasn't long, but it was everything she wished she'd told them all, the ones who had drifted in and out of her life, the ones who still didn't understand what she had become. The letter was meant for a future grandchild, someone who would one day look back on this life, a life that had been full of so much noise, so much giving without ever receiving. She knew she wouldn't be around forever, but she hoped, at least, that this would be her legacy, the one thing that could speak for her when she was gone. She'd included stories from her past, little tidbits about her childhood, things she had kept to herself for so long. Advice, too. Simple things she wished someone had told her. Know your worth. Don't let anyone take it from you. There was a small photo in the envelope as well, one of her holding baby Marissa, a smile on her face that wasn't as guarded as it had been in those days. Mia stood across the table, her eyes tracing the words as she read. She hadn't expected the letter to be so intimate, so full of things Kat had never said out loud. When Mia reached the end, her eyes were damp, a tear slipping down her cheek as she lifted her gaze to meet Kat's. I didn't know, Mia said softly, her voice thick with emotion. You were so much more than you let on. Kat met her gaze, her expression unreadable. I'm not disappearing, Mia, she said, her voice steady but firm. I'm just choosing who sees me, who deserves to know. Mia nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She didn't need to ask anything more. She understood. The air in the room felt different after that, as though a space had opened up between them, an understanding that hadn't been there before. Kat wasn't the woman everyone expected her to be anymore. She wasn't someone they could take advantage of, or try to manipulate into the role they had always wanted her to play. Later that week, Kat found herself at the hospital, walking down the sterile hallways with a box of baby supplies in hand. She had donated to the Teen Mom program, feeling a quiet pride in knowing that the resources would go to someone who needed them. She'd once been where they were, with nothing, no one to help her when everything had seemed impossible. Now she had something to give, something that could make a difference, even in the smallest way. She left the supplies at the reception desk and turned to leave, but Grace was waiting for her at the door, leaning against the frame with a quiet smile. You finally got free, didn't you? Grace asked, her voice low but filled with warmth. Kat didn't say anything at first, just took a deep breath. For the first time, it felt like the weight was truly gone, as if she had finally shed everything that had been holding her down. The past wasn't a part of her anymore, not the way it had been. She was free now, and for the first time in so long, she could feel it. Yeah, Kat finally said, a small smile tugging at her lips. I did. As she stepped out of the hospital, the world seemed just a little bit lighter, and for the first time, Kat knew she could walk into the future without fear. What came next was hers to claim. The sound of the front door creaking open echoed through the quiet house. Kat didn't need to look up, she knew who it was. Becca's voice floated in from the hallway, light and casual, the way it always was when she came by. They're busy, Becca said, stepping into the room, her eyes bright despite the slight frown on her face. I wanted to see the lemon tree. Kat smiled softly, her heart swelling a little at the sight of Becca. Standing there with her shoes kicked off, looking like she belonged in this space as much as she always had. It missed you, Kat replied, her tone light but full of warmth. Becca's face broke into a grin as she skipped toward the back door. Kat followed her into the yard, where the lemon tree stood, strong and stubborn, its branches heavy with ripening fruit. Becca ran her fingers over the rough bark, her eyes scanning the tree as if searching for something. I can't believe it's still here, Becca said, her voice softer now, more contemplative. It's been a while. It's resilient, Kat said, watching the way Becca studied the tree. Just like you. Becca laughed lightly, her hands now reaching for the lemons. She picked one and held it up, as if it were a trophy. Let's make lemonade, she declared. And just like that, they were in the kitchen, slicing and squeezing, their hands sticky with the sweet scent of fresh fruit. The simple act of making lemonade felt like an old tradition, like something they had done together countless times before. The laughter bubbled up easily, over nothing at all, just the sound of life happening in a way that felt good. Real. Nothing forced, nothing expected, just two people enjoying each other's company. Grace appeared in the doorway, holding her camera as she watched them for a moment. The hint of a smile on her lips. She lifted the camera, capturing the scene before either of them noticed. The picture would later find its way into a frame, labeled simply, Love Unpaid. It wasn't much, but it was everything. As the evening light softened, painting the room with golden hues, Kat and Becca sat on the porch, the glass of lemonade resting between them. Becca leaned into Kat, her head on her shoulder, and for a while, they didn't say anything at all. They just watched the sun sink lower, the world around them slowing down as the evening stretched into night. Kat's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from the peaceful silence. She fished it out and saw the message from Ty. Is she with you? For a moment, she just stared at the text, the weight of his words sinking in. The tension between them was still there, but it no longer mattered. She looked down at Becca, who was humming quietly to herself, content in her own little world, and made her decision. Kat snapped a quick photo of Becca, her face framed by the setting sun, her smile innocent and free. She sent it to Ty with a simple reply. Yes, it wasn't an answer Ty had wanted, but it was the one he needed to hear. Kat wasn't going to fight for the past anymore. The future was in her hands now, and Becca was a part of it. As she sent the photo and placed her phone down, the door clicked softly behind Grace as she joined them, settling into the quiet of the moment. The weight of everything that had been left unresolved felt distant now, like an old echo, fading into the background of their shared peace. For the first time in a long while, Kat knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Kat's thumb scrolled slowly across the screen of her phone, her gaze following the words as if she could somehow erase them just by not looking at them. The name, Jacobs, appeared on the screen again, a reminder that the past was never far away, no matter how much she had tried to leave it behind. It stung briefly, but the feeling was fleeting now, like a ghost brushing against her skin. It didn't matter anymore. She let out a slow breath, locking the phone and setting it down on the counter. Her hands were steady, but inside, something shifted. It always did when the past reared its head, when reminders of the life she had walked away from came uninvited. Grace, who had been watching her from across the room, spoke up, her voice steady and knowing. "That's their daughter, but this is your life," she said. Her words simple but loaded with the kind of truth that only Grace could deliver. The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Kat nodded slowly, not responding immediately. She didn't need to. Grace's words were enough. Later, the quiet hum of a door opening caught her attention. Mia was standing at the threshold, a small ceramic nameplate in her hands, her face soft with an unspoken question. Kat watched her as she walked across the room and gently affixed the nameplate to the door, Hollis House. It was small, simple, but it carried more significance than any name on a legal document. This house, this life, was hers now. She stepped back, taking it in, her fingers resting on the edge of the doorframe. There was a kind of finality in the way Mia had placed it, like it had always been meant to be here, waiting for this moment. Hollis House, not tied to any history, but her own. Kat smiled softly, the peace settling into her bones. She didn't need the past to define her anymore. Not when she had this. She moved through the house, each room familiar but new in its stillness, the light flickering through the windows, casting soft shadows on the walls. She hummed quietly to herself, the melody a reflection of the calm inside her. Her peace wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be. It didn't need to shout to be felt. It was a presence that filled the rooms quietly, like the air itself had finally settled into its place. Her feet took her to the dining room, where the table sat, perfectly set for one. She had always prepared a place for guests, always made room for others, even when there hadn't been room for her own needs. But today was different. Today she placed a new setting at the table, not for anyone else, but for herself. It was a small gesture, the placement of a single plate, a fork, a glass of water. But in that simple act, Kat felt the weight of everything that had led her here, everything she had let go of. The table was no longer a space filled with expectation, with need. It was hers to fill now, hers to claim. She set the last fork down, her hand lingering for a moment before she pulled away. The world outside the window was quiet, the night settling in with a soft hush. For the first time in a long time, Kat felt like she could finally breathe. Her life was her own again, and it was enough. Her gaze drifted back to the nameplate on the door, Hollis House, and for the first time, she knew it was where she was meant to be. As she sat down at the table, the weight of the past didn't feel as heavy. It was gone, and she, for the first time, felt truly free. The door creaked open, and Mia stepped inside, her goddaughter cradled gently in her arms. Kat was waiting, watching as Mia crossed the threshold, her soft smile radiating a quiet warmth. This house, Hollis House, was no longer a symbol of what had been expected of her. It was now a place where she could breathe without the weight of others' demands. And today, it would welcome something new, the future. Mia walked toward Kat. The baby nestled against her chest, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Kat stepped forward and, with a practiced gentleness, took the baby from her, cradling her carefully. The baby's small weight in her arms was a reminder of everything that had come before, of a time when she had been the one who gave, who nurtured, who carried the weight of others' needs. "I wasn't done being useful," Kat said softly, her eyes meeting Mia's. "Just done being used." There was a strength in her words, a truth that had been carved out over time. This house, this life, was no longer a place of sacrifice for others. It was a home built for herself, and now she could share it with the people who truly saw her. Mia nodded, her eyes glistening with understanding. They didn't need more words. The quiet solidarity between them spoke volumes. Grace was in the kitchen, the kettle humming quietly on the stove. The scent of steeping tea filled the air, a small comfort in the stillness of the house. She appeared in the doorway, her expression serene, holding 2 cups of tea. She handed one to Kat, who took it with a grateful nod. The garden gate creaked softly in the breeze outside, a sound so familiar it felt like part of the house itself. Becca, sitting quietly nearby, had taken to her crayons, coloring in a notebook, lost in her own world of imagination. The peace in the room felt like a balm, soothing and steadying everything that had been fractured. Kat's gaze wandered through the open doorway to the front hall, the long hallway stretching out before her. The walls were bare now, the pictures gone, everything stripped down to its quiet essentials. She moved slowly toward the hall, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. Reaching the end of the hall, she turned and looked back, her eyes tracing the clean lines of the space. It was empty of the past. This was no longer the house that had housed her entanglement with others' expectations. This was her home now. She snapped a quick photo, her fingers capturing the emptiness, the stillness, the space that had been cleared. This was the final shot, one that marked the end of a chapter. Her hand reached to her pocket, pulling out her keychain. The jingling sound was no longer a mess of keys for doors that no longer mattered. Now there was only one key, the right one. As she turned toward the living room, the house felt quieter, freer, as if it had exhaled alongside her. She was no longer a prisoner of someone else's narrative. She was writing her own now. Later, as the house settled into its evening rhythm, Kat couldn't help but remember her daughter's baby shower, the last time she had been surrounded by those who thought they knew what she needed. She had been the one expected to give, to provide, to be the useful one. Her daughter's husband had joked, as they all did, "She's here for the free food." Kat smiled to herself, the memory sweet with irony. "He lost his appetite," she whispered softly to herself, a quiet sense of satisfaction curling at the corners of her mouth. "When I handed the house keys to someone else." The finality of it felt perfect,